Hello, I'm John Haskell from the Library of Congress. Today, the John W. Kluge Center presents a conversation between two leading historians of the African American experience, both of whom have strong connections to the Library of Congress. Adam Rothman of Georgetown University was a distinguished visiting scholar at the Kluge Center in 2018. And Martha Jones from Johns Hopkins University is a Library of Congress Scholars Council member and a current distinguished visiting scholar at the Kluge Center. Adam is going to interview Martha on her research at the library and on her four-book project. Adam, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. It's really a pleasure to be here with Professor Jones, speaking about her work at the Kluge Center. Kluge Center is a wonderful place to do research, to study history. You get access to places like the beautiful space behind me, the Jefferson Reading Room at the Library of Congress. So, Martha, I'm kind of curious. Let's just start with the broad question of what brought you to the Kluge Center?
Thanks so much, first of all, Adam, for doing this with me. And you know the answer. You brought me to the Kluge Center, which is to say, back when you were a visiting scholar here, you were very kind to invite me to come in and have a peek behind the scenes at some remarkable materials you were working with, and then to be part of a podcast episode, which was part of your work during your time here. And once I saw behind the scenes, my wheels got turning. And I had been contemplating a book project that would draw importantly on holdings here at the library. So this seemed like a great opportunity. And so thanks to John Haskell and the Kluge Center for inviting me to follow in your footsteps.
Well, I had not even actually made that connection, and I wasn't fishing for that connection. But we did have a great time together making that podcast about some materials here at the library, and I want to talk about the kinds of things that you're looking at in a moment. But I do know that you are working on a biography of Roger Taney, the fifth, if I'm not mistaken, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who is most well known, perhaps infamous, for authoring the opinion in Dred Scott versus Sandford. I have to confess, I was quite surprised when I heard that you were writing a biography of Taney. You are an eminent historian, particularly of African American women's history, but also law and political struggle, particularly by African Americans. I think of your incredible book, Birthright Citizens, which is about African American struggles for citizenship in the 19th century. So there's clearly a connection to Taney there, which we could draw out. But I'm wondering how you made the jump from that world that you've been working in, especially African American women's history, to a biography of this one of the most infamous figures in American history, Roger Taney.
Yeah. You're not alone in your surprise. So I can say a few things about what brought me to this project in this form, because you're right. I had encountered Justice Taney quite a bit when I was writing Birthright Citizens. It's set in Baltimore City, which was his hometown for most of his adult life. It is a book that pivots to an important degree on the decision in Dred Scott. And so through that, I had the chance to spend a lot of time in his papers, scattered as they are in many repositories around the country. And while only some of that made it into the book, I began to develop my own point of view on really what drove Justice Taney, what his preoccupations were, both as a justice, but also personally and politically. And I thought that the literature, as it existed, it's been a long time since Taney's had a biography, more than a half century, but that the literature just wasn't fitting with what I was seeing. And at the same time, I think this is a direction for African American history, for us to come with our literature, with our archives, with our point of view to some of these, consequential figures. It won't surprise you that Annette Gordon Reed's work, rethinking Thomas Jefferson from, for example, the perspective of Sally Hemings and her family, influenced me deeply into appreciating how we really can and need to come back to some of these figures and see them through that lens. And no one had really done that yet for Justice Taney. So here I am.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The idea of looking at somebody like Taney through a new lens, using the new tools of the perspectives that have been developed over the last 50 years since the last biography of Taney. That's a really inspiring, I think, and intriguing approach to writing a biography of somebody like him. Before we talk about Taney himself, I am curious about the archives, about the sources. You mentioned that there are scattered papers that document the life of Taney. So give us a sense of what it is you're actually looking at when you talk about his papers. What does that mean? And are they actual papers, or are you just reading everything? Is this all online these days?
Yeah, partly Taney's papers immediately, he dies in 1864. He's quite advanced in age, and there are folks already jockeying to write the first biography of Justice Taney. And so there emerges a kind of contest over control of his papers, as well as their interpretation. And as a result, they get pretty much scattered. So there are lots of places you have to go in order to, in a sense, build your own archive of Justice Taney. And because I had worked for a long time in Baltimore, I had seen most, if not all, of what is in Baltimore related to him. But I hadn't gone much beyond that. You caught me on a great day, because I just spent the morning today in the manuscript reading room here at the Library of Congress, where I was in the papers of a one-time Johns Hopkins political scientist, Carl Brent Swisher. Why the papers of Swisher? Well, Swisher in 1935 writes a biography of Roger Taney, and then later goes on to contribute to the first major writing of the history of the Supreme Court, and he writes the Taney years on this for that collection. And so I spent the morning. I think you would love this, Adam. I don't know what a historian who wouldn't, basically rummaging through the notes and the papers, the photocopies and more of a historian who now, many years before, set out in his own way to write the history of Roger Taney. It was like rummaging through somebody's amazing file cabinet, and it's all there. So that is the sort of thing that being at the library gives me access to. These are not materials that are digitized or transcribed or available any other way, but marvelously there are, I think, upwards of 30 boxes of Swisher's materials that I will spend time in and benefit from. If I could say one more thing, one of the great things about Swisher's time and the work he did on writing the history of the Supreme Court is that it turns out behind him there was a team of researchers here at the library whose job it was to support those who were authoring this history. So they scoured archives all over the country looking for Taney-related materials and then had them sent here so that Swisher could use them. So today I feel like I hit the jackpot, and I'm really benefiting from what is unique here at the Library of Congress.
That's amazing. I'm so jealous. and I just want to
Please.
say for those those who might be watching this is that for it's been a tough 2 years for historians because we haven't, for the most part, been able to physically access the archival materials that are really the lifeblood of our research. So now that we're just starting to creep back into the archives, there is a sense of kind of coming back to life. And to hear you talk about the Swisher papers just, makes that clear to me. Can't wait to get back to the manuscript reading room at the Library of Congress. It almost sounds like in a way, you're retracing the steps of these earlier historians, but with a compass that just points in a totally new direction. And I think that's something that's exciting about history, is that you can look at materials that other people have looked at, but see something new. And that's what history is about.
We're much maligned for this, right? I think in popular parlance, but there's no question, but that in part, why else would somebody like Swisher leave us his papers, except that he expected us to come back and to think about his work, certainly, but to rethink the kinds of questions that he asked. So I think it's not only fair game, I think it's really an important window into how historians work, with the expectation, all right, that others come behind us and new theories, new archives, new points of view, new questions, and hence a new biography.
Yeah, great. So we've mentioned the Dred Scott case. It's clearly the case that Tawney is most closely associated with. So let's talk about it for a moment. What exactly was the Dred Scott case about, and what did Tawney's decision do?
There's a lot to say about Dred Scott, so I'm going to take an important slice.
Sure.
And it's important to say that Dred Scott was a man held enslaved when he brought his suit in the city of St. Louis in Missouri, along with his wife and 2 daughters.
Harriet,
Scott,
right? Her name was Harriet.
Thank you. And the Scotts had been earlier in their lives brought to what were non-slaveholding or free territories, free soil in the United States. And at a juncture in their lives in the early 1850s, my view is because their daughters are with them and vulnerable to being sold or separated from their parents, they bring a freedom suit rooted in the claim that once they were on free soil, they became free people and they could not be re-enslaved even when they returned to the state of Missouri, where slaveholding continued to be the law of the land. The case has a long, very circuitous route through the state courts and federal courts, but it winds up at the U.S. Supreme Court, where, among other things, the court has to decide whether someone like Dred Scott, an enslaved person of African descent, has the right even to bring a case in federal court. And hence, the question of whether or not Mr. Scott is a citizen of the United States arises. The Constitution provides a number of routes by which to bring a case in U.S. courts. One of them is when citizens of different states have a dispute. But Scott can only bring his case if he's a citizen of the United States. And this permits Justice Tawney to get to a question that has been gnawing at him for a very long time. The question of Black citizenship has been much debated. This is the subject of my book, Birthright Citizens. But Tawney finally, in 1857, has the opportunity to render an opinion on the question of Black citizenship, and will conclude that no Black person in the United States, be they enslaved like Mr. Scott or a free person, no Black person can be a citizen of the United States by the terms of the Constitution. And it is a devastating blow for the Scott family, who by consequence are put out of court and cannot win their freedom suit. But it is a devastating decision for all Black Americans, including free Black Americans who have long promoted, insisted, advocated for the position that they are citizens of the United States by way of the Constitution. It wins Justice Taney much criticism, and ultimately he ends his career deeply disappointed, despondent even over how ill-regarded his decision in Dred Scott quickly becomes.
Thanks for that synopsis. It is a very complicated case, and I think you've laid out that central issue. One of the lines from the opinion is probably the most infamous words penned by a Supreme Court justice. Taney, in his opinion, wrote that the founding generation regarded Black people, and this is what his actual words, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. I know those words mean a lot to you, Martha. Could you parse them a bit for us? What do those words tell us about the way Taney thought about Black people, about the law, about interpreting the Constitution?
So here Taney is reaching back to the founding, reaching for a debate that has roiled practically since the founding, right? What were the founders' intentions vis-a-vis Black Americans? Who were they intended to be before the Constitution? And he is weighing in and using a mode of argumentation that is indeed historical, right? Much of the opinion in Dred Scott is a highly selective, we might say profoundly distorted, but nonetheless deliberate approach to use the history of discrimination against Black Americans, the history of Black laws in the period before Dred Scott is decided, the general racism that permeates so much of American law, but also culture and politics. Taney is attempting to mobilize all of that to make the case that, in fact, it's nearly axiomatic that the Constitution did not intend to include Black Americans as citizens of the United States. The evidence in Taney's very self-serving argument appears to be overwhelming. It is important to say that he is weighing in on a highly disputed question, even in 1857. American lawmakers, be they jurists or members of Congress or state legislatures or just political pundits, really don't agree about what the founders intended with respect to Black Americans. And since the founding, Black Americans have been variously leveling claims on the Constitution. One of the misunderstandings about Dred Scott is that it somehow settled that question. And in fact, it doesn't. Lower courts don't defer by and large to Justice Taney. They continue to find their ways around Dred Scott and arrive at their own conclusions about Black citizenship. And as we know, by 1861, the nation is going to wind up in the midst of civil war, and the regime change begins very quickly, such that the Lincoln administration will begin to dismantle Dred Scott. Hence, Justice Taney's despondency over the decision. He really never gets to settle the question or to see his ideas prevail. Nonetheless, his rhetoric and the seat that he occupies as Chief Justice of the United States means that politically, culturally, affectively, his words are powerful and devastating.
Yeah, I have the sense that Tawney actually thought the Dred Scott decision would resolve the problem of slavery in national politics, but it just adds fuel to the fire. And 3 years later, the country descends into civil war, which will result ultimately in the repudiation of the doctrine he sets forth in Dred Scott. So it's no wonder he was despondent. It's interesting that he dies in 1864 before final emancipation. So he never sees the kind of ironic fruit of his work. So there are puzzles about what Tawney was trying to do with the Dred Scott decision and the politics that ensued, but there's also a bit of a riddle about Tawney himself, because the man is somewhat complicated personally on the issue of slavery, right? He issues this profoundly pro-slavery opinion, but he himself, correct me if I'm wrong, but he himself manumitted the people that he owned. So tell me if that's right, and if the story is more complicated than that.
Among historians are those who have represented what Tawney did vis-a-vis the enslaved people he claimed as property back in the 18th century. They have, I think, overread that moment. Tawney is the son of a planter, but he is of a generation, a slaveholding planter in Maryland. But he's of a generation of men in Maryland who are going to walk away from their father's destinies. Tawney becomes a lawyer, his brother a physician. And this is very typical in Maryland in Tawney's generation. So what do these folks do? These are not abolitionists who are out of their enlightened benevolence going to free enslaved people. These are property owners who have no use personally for this form of property and confront the question of what then to do. And Tawney converts the enslaved people that he owns into what in Maryland we refer to as term slaves. So now these are people who are not bound to Justice Tawney for life any longer, but instead will work for him for a definitive period. Oftentimes for women, it's until 21, for young men until 24. But they'll work for him for a definitive period, in essence, to purchase their own freedom, to compensate himself. And there's nothing particularly novel about this approach to how to extract oneself from slaveholding without suffering a financial compromise. In a state like Maryland, it's very, very typical. And so to read that as an act of unbridled enlightenment, a repudiation slavery, benevolence is an overread, but that is important because it helps us appreciate Justice Tawney's baseline, if you will, relationship to slavery, which is not one of a radical abolitionist view. That movement hasn't even been born, really, right, in the 18th century. But more to the point, Justice Tawney, in my view, is, I think, slavery, yes or no, but Justice Tawney is a colonizationist. He is someone who believes that whatever the fate of slavery, whatever the fate of enslaved people might be, or former slaves might be, his job, his role across the course of his career, including Dred Scott, is to ensure that the United States remains a white man's country, that Black people, former slaves, never get a toehold politically, economically, socially, such that that equation, right, in the public order is not disturbed. And this, I think, is frankly the thread of Taney's thinking and the thread of Taney's purpose that other biographers, understandably as they were preoccupied with the question of where Taney was on slavery, missed that in fact what preoccupied Taney as much as the problem of slavery was the problem of emancipation and a world in which Black people would look to, as they were in Baltimore and in many other places, where they were looking to be full-fledged citizens of the United States.
And so just to pull on the thread of colonization a bit more, to clarify maybe for those who are not completely familiar with the movement, the colonizationists advocated for the removal of free and freed African Americans from the United States. And by the 1830s and 1840s, their preferred destination was the West African colony, then Republic of Liberia. So in other words, they just wanted to get rid of African Americans altogether. That was their solution to the problem of slavery.
Yeah, and this means that it helps us understand what's underneath the overreach that Taney engages in Dred Scott, right? Because to leave or to allow Black people to be citizens is to give them the ultimate, if you will, defense against the project of colonization, that project that looks to encourage, cajole, arm twist, and even forcibly remove them from the United States. And so citizenship becomes that arbiter, right, of the colonization project as a whole.
The colonizationists really imagined a future in where the United States was exclusively white. I mean, is it not fair to call them white nationalists? They believed in a white nation, right?
They believe that the United States is a white man's country. Yeah. Yes, and Black people can be part of that, right, as laborers, as bound people. But what Black people can't be are members of the body politic in the colonizationist view. And it's important to say, colonization is one of the largest political movements, if you will, of the early 19th century. It dwarfs the abolitionist movement when we look at those who sign up, who join colonization societies. It cuts across party lines. It includes Northerners and Southerners. And so that sentiment, right, that undergirds colonization is what I think we continue to need to attend to. And Taney gives us a chance to see how colonizationist thinking becomes entrenched in American law as well as in American politics in these decades.
Yeah, that's really important to point out the broad popularity of the colonizationist movement. But it wasn't unopposed, right? I mean, Black and white abolitionists fiercely condemned colonization. In fact, in a sense, what made somebody an abolitionist was often opposition to colonization. The belief that white and Black people could live together in the United States on some kind of rough equality.
Absolutely. And among Black Americans, it is that rising up in opposition to the formal establishment of the American Colonization Society in 1816. Or 17, I hope I got that right. But it is the establishment of the society, right, that well before William Lloyd Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society is the organizing around the formal consolidation of the colonization movement that is one of the catalysts for Black politics in the 19th century. So I think you can't tell that story without appreciating the staunch opposition to colonization.
No, thanks for that. Let's turn now to what you might call the afterlife of Roger Taney, the struggle over his memory and memorialization. I read recently that Charles Sumner, the anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, once said that Taney would be hooted down in the pages of history
Mm.
or something like that. Hooted down in the pages. He did not think that history would be kind to Roger Taney. But it seems like history has been kinder to Taney than Sumner anticipated. Could you talk a little bit about the resuscitation of Roger Taney in historical memory, especially in Maryland? And I'm really curious to know where you have come across Taney, his image, his portrait, his bust, his icons that honor the man in our public landscape of memory. Because there's more than you might think, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's important to say, right, Sumner is speaking those words on the floor of Congress in opposition to a proposal, right, that Congress appropriate funds to commission a bust of Taney to honor him for his service as Chief Justice of the United States. So from the very beginning, right, in the immediate wake of Taney's death, his memory, and there was a contest over his memory and how he should be remembered or honored, if at all. But for me, I discover him not over in the Capitol, but first in the Baltimore City Courthouse, which is a place that sits not far from where Taney lived during his life in Baltimore City, but in its efforts to, if you will, construct its own importance, right, on our historical landscape, honors Justice Taney. After all, he was Chief Justice of the United States for nearly 3 decades, 3 consequential decades. He is, for a long time, a favorite son of Maryland. One of the places I wound up visiting in trying to understand his memory is the city of Frederick in Maryland, in Western Maryland, where Taney lived for many years in his adulthood, practiced law in Frederick. And there's a curious historical site in Frederick called the Roger Taney House. It's a bit of a misnomer. He never lived there, though he owned the property for a very short time. But it was refurbished into a historical site in the 20th century by local boosters in Frederick who were, in essence, looking to draw tourists who were traveling, I think, from Pennsylvania, to Baltimore, to Washington. Along the way, you got to stop over somewhere, and you might stop over in Frederick if there were some worthy sites. And this house gets picked up and interpreted, mythologized, because in some ways, along with Maryland's first governor, Johnson, and Francis Scott Key of Star Spangled Banner fame, this is the best bet Frederick has in those years for attracting tourists. And in fact, it succeeds. It had some really interesting accomplices because justices from the U.S. Supreme Court, Charles Evans Hughes in the 30s and William Rehnquist decades later, will come down to give their imprimatur to this historic tribute to Justice Taney. So we discover the ways in which, as you say, in expected and some really unexpected places, his memory has persisted. I'm a Baltimorean who moved to the city just as Justice Taney's likeness was being removed from a public pedestal that sits absolutely right in front of my front door. And that moment, which happens in the wake of the violent, the fatal clash over monuments in Charlottesville, Virginia that summer, reminded me that we still are contesting over Taney's memory, and that he really is someone not only to appreciate for his role in the past, but to appreciate for how he continues to be a symbol a contested one, a complicated one for us, even in the 21st century. I have neighbors who were incensed that Taney was removed from his pedestal, and others, of course, who cheered that. I confess I was a little bit of two minds, because encountering him in the morning was a way for me to remember that I wanted to get to the Library of Congress and do that research and write this book. But I appreciate that the symbolism was profoundly provocative in our city in 2018, and it was time for the monument to come down.
Interesting. Yeah, we've had a lot of debate about monuments. Most of them about Confederate monuments, and I think one of the interesting things about Taney being a Maryland Unionist is that it's not really a question. It's not a question of treason in his case. It's a question of racism, and it really puts that question squarely in the public mind. I do have a soft spot for Maryland's struggle to be remembered. It's kind of stuck between Pennsylvania and Philadelphia on the one hand, and Washington and Virginia on the other, and they seem to get all the attention. But Maryland has a great history, and an important history. And I teach history at Georgetown University, which is deeply connected to the long history of Catholics in Maryland, slaveholding Catholics in Maryland. I have to add. But I myself have learned a lot about Maryland's rich history just over the last few years. It's a fascinating and complicated place, and I think Taney is a fascinating and complicated figure. Go ahead.
Well, one of the debates that we have in the wake of the removal of Justice Taney and other of what were Confederate monuments from Baltimore City is what might go in their place. Does Baltimore, does Maryland have a surviving pantheon of historical figures who we could agree, right, should sit on a pedestal? Justice Taney's bust was recently removed from the just outside the old Supreme Court chamber in the U.S. Capitol to be replaced by another Marylander, Thurgood Marshall, another member of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the answer is yes, right? Maryland does have a deep bench, right, of important.
Is that a judicial pun? A deep bench?
I like that.
I appreciate that.
You can borrow that. So we have that, but we live in a time where, as you know, arriving at that kind of consensus is not easy for us. And I, for one, because I live just there, have found it really powerful to observe what goes on an empty plinth once someone like Taney has been removed. And so in our community, there are rituals of cleansing, there are musical interludes and performance pieces. There is graffiti tagging and more that goes on that pedestal that is a really interesting barometer of what we're concerned about in any given moment. And it is sort of like a living monument to the moment, not one in bronze, right, that is sort of immutable, but instead one where Baltimoreans use that pedestal for all kinds of public expressions of who we are and what concerns us. And I actually, for one, hope it stays that way. It's a fascinating other kind of monument to live with.
Yeah, maybe we can project some new visions of what history means onto that empty plinth. That's fascinating. So we've talked a lot about Roger Taney and his legacy, but and we're probably coming close to the end of our time, but I have to ask you about what's next after Taney, because, and I have to preface this question by saying you're kind of a big deal in the history world, because you have signed I never heard of this before, like a 4-book deal with Basic Books. And they've said, I'm amazed by this. writing one book seems so daunting to me, but you've got four lined up. So what's next for you after Tawny? After you dispatch Roger Taney, what do you think is on the horizon in your research agenda?
Yeah. So I have to say, for you and maybe for a few others out there, this was not some sort of indenture, right? I really did want to write these four books, and I'm really excited about it. And I'm very grateful to the team at Basic Books for, their faith in me and sort of my long vision for my work. While I'm researching the Tawny book, I'm actually finishing a book that comes before it, tentatively titled A Jagged Color Line. And a jagged color line is one part a history of slavery and sexual violence and the resonances of that violence across generations. So 2 centuries look at the slavery and sexual violence and its consequences. And the other part is it's a family memoir. So I am returning to long ago my deep interest in and preoccupation with family history, and visiting the question of slavery and sexual violence and its legacies through the women in my own family. So when I'm not down in the manuscript room, which has got me nearly all my attention after this morning's encounter, I'm upstairs in the Kluge Center at the library, putting the finishing touches on the chapters of A Jagged Color Line.
Well, that is a sobering topic, but it's exciting to me to hear that you're writing about that, and weaving together memoir with history. It sounds like it's going to be an incredible book. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4 books. I'm looking forward to all of them. Martha, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your insights into the life, career, and legacy of Roger Taney. I think we would both thank the Kluge Center for this opportunity, and the Library of Congress, this opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you, Ad.